ended after we have had to drop more sessions than I would really have liked, I have decided to give another lecture on Thursday 28th, and I would be very grateful to you, given that the lectures are conceived as a whole, if you could all arrange to attend that one as well. Lecture 14. The 14th of July 1960. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can now return to our reflections on the concept of ideology and, if we are lucky, bring this discussion to a close today. First of all, I would just like to say a few words about the history of the concept of ideology. At least with regard to some of the principal stages of this history, the story has been very well told and vividly presented by Hans Barth in his book Truth and Ideology, which was published in Zurich in 1945. And I would certainly take this opportunity to recommend it to you if you wish to orient yourselves with respect to this whole complex of issues. Now, of course, there has always been talk of something like false consciousness, and indeed of supposedly widespread false consciousness. One only has to think of Heraclitus and his talk of the foolish and deluded many. This was a common enough typo in ancient thought, and it might be rather grandiose to interpret this simply as a justificatory or defensive ideology on the part of an old aristocratic order which found itself threatened by emergent democratic movements in Greece during the 6th and 7th centuries BC. For it seems to me more likely that the claim to authority, or perhaps also to the market value, which the more or less unattached or wandering philosophers of the time cultivated, was naturally bound up with the fact that they presented themselves as initiates in possession of true insight, whereas others were enthralled to mere opinion. And of course this notion is reproduced in Plato's fundamental distinction between truth and appearance, where appearance is generally identified with immediate sense perception, while truth is identified with reason. Now, whatever we may think about the disparagement of the sensible element in knowledge which is implied here, this thought already involves something which has been decisive for the entire history of the modern concept of ideology, namely that the essential task, in contrast to all ideology, is precisely to break through immediate appearances, through some semblance or facade, and penetrate to some more or less concealed core. Here again you can see that the problem regarding the historical significance of nominalism and conceptual realism, which we have repeatedly touched on in the course of these lectures, is not really that simple. And in today's lecture I should like to encourage you, with specific reference to this intellectual model, to maintain a free and open mind with respect to such hackneyed and well-worn notions. For it is of course the case that nominalist movements take sensuous knowledge, the immediately given, that is that which is mere semblance or appearance, for the other philosophical approach, to be the only real source of knowledge, while what is concealed by appearances, truth in the sense of aletheia, is scorned as a purely metaphysical construction by Enlightenment thought in the broadest sense. Yet this very distinction between essence and appearance, between the underlying structural laws and the outer facade, expresses precisely what is central where the recognition of ideology is concerned. For the task is to see through the phenomena of the facade, the surface phenomena which serve to conceal what effectively holds the whole process together, and thus allows us to recognize the essential laws or principles which are at work. And to that extent the theory of ideology in its classical form is also the heir to philosophy insofar as it opposes a concept of essence or structure to the merely ephemeral and deceptive phenomena of the facade. Now this tendency towards objectivity, which I have specifically emphasized here, has generally not been as uncontested in the history of the theory of ideology and has certainly not proved as dominant as this might originally appear. I shall try and explain why. In the early bourgeois phase of social development in Elizabethan England, Bacon was the first person who seriously attempted to identify those more or less constant intrusions or disturbing factors which made scientific knowledge, or knowledge properly based upon experience, effectively impossible. Yet he proceeded in an intrinsically subjectivistic way, as is indeed already suggested by the long-established talk of the many, hoi polloi, whose eyes are covered by a veil which only an esoterically initiated few are able to remove. The four idols which he identified are all essentially subjectivistic, in the sense that they are ascribed either to human nature as such or simply to particular structures of consciousness, without raising the issue of essence at all. Thus the problem as to how far these forms of consciousness are themselves determined by society does not even arise, not to mention the really profound and in this field utterly decisive question about the necessity of such deceptive appearance, and ultimately about the truth content which this kind of appearance itself also involves. In other words, Bacon's doctrine of idols, if I may say a few words about this here, offers us a partly anthropological and partly psychological doctrine of the illusions or disturbances to which our consciousness is exposed merely from the side of the subject, as it were, in its relation to objects, which are taken as things that are just there in themselves in the sense of naive realism. On this conception, therefore, the task of knowledge is simply to experience these objects in the most adequate and least distorted way, but thereby also in an essentially passive way. Many of these idols are unreservedly idealist in character, such as the so-called idola specus, or the idols of the mirror, which refer to the idea that the individual, in other words, psychological, nature of particular human beings impedes their knowledge of the truth because it leads them to introduce certain factors which diverge from universal reason. This is basically the first appearance of a theme which subsequently proved hugely influential for the psychological relativism of a later time under the name of the personal equation. On the other hand, with the idols that are described as idolatry, we find something that returns in the Enlightenment motif of simple class betrayal. Here the idols, or, if you like, the ideologies, the false images of reality, become nothing but a matter of attitude, of deliberate betrayal, of cunning persuasion. What is criticized now are those late manifestations of the rhetorical tradition that emerged out of a decaying feudalism, a tradition that, within the older scholastic discipline that had itself built on classical school of rhetoric, had certainly once seen better days. These idolatry are really no different from the types of ideology that we could describe today as political propaganda in the narrow sense, the manipulated tricks which are simply designed to sway people as required. By far the most interesting of these idols from the perspective of the theory of ideology are unquestionably the idolaphori, for these idols are actually rooted in the realm of language, are conceived in terms of a critique of language, and spring from the claim that language, as a universal means of communication, intrinsically produces certain forms that end up functioning independently and thus cannot actually express adequately what they are supposed to mean. It is worth noting that, in the later phase of bourgeois thought, this particular motif, namely an examination of ideology that amounts to little more than a critique of language and a concern with the objective assumed by subjective communication, turns out to be one of the essential forms in which contemporary positivism undertakes to absorb and at the same time to neutralize the theory of ideology under the banner of semantics, an approach which is particularly popular in many places today under the name of analytical philosophy. Now I certainly do not deny the value of such investigations, which require the close analysis and critical examination of language itself and the ways it is used. For I believe that such investigations can prove immensely productive and that one may learn an enormous amount from the examination of language about the social whole and the actual character of the world in which it is used and spoken. And as many of you will already know, I have frequently undertaken inquiries of this sort myself. But the problematic aspect of a theory of ideology which is oriented solely to the critical examination of language, so it seems to me, lies in the fact that such an examination, pursued in isolation from other things, can easily become a kind of fetishism. In other words, This approach comes to believe that the confusions and deceptive tendencies which we can observe in language can all be traced back simply to the supposedly equivocal, impure, non-logical and emotionally colored employment of words, whereas what we have to recognize is the constant interaction between words, to see them as a kind of force field between what they are in language and what they have come to mean, and thus what real society is. And to the extent that the former approach treats language, qua means of communication, as an absolute, what you have here is another attempt to offer a subjective theory of ideology, albeit one that is couched in a seemingly more objective form. Now the history of the concept of ideology, which I shall not try and present for you in any real detail here, starts with the insight that, behind the idols we mentioned earlier, there lie certain interests of one kind or another, such as those already suggested by old Bacon with his idol of theatry, but it eventually leads to a developed insight into ideology as a socially necessary illusion that is nonetheless grounded in objectivity. I believe that we can hardly insist too strongly that the concept of ideology can only be employed in a serious way as long as it is not interpreted in terms of a mere psychology of interests. Yet the concept of ideology eventually met with a remarkable fate, for after Marx had formulated his great insight that the task was to criticize ideologies while simultaneously deriving them, and in a sense thereby also redeeming them, in terms of their objectivity, this concept of ideology was effectively lost, and the idea of ideology reverted to a kind of subjectivism which was extraordinarily similar to that which we find in the early phase of bourgeois society, in the pre-Enlightenment period of Bacon and in the later Enlightenment period of the 18th century. Thus it is quite possible to show that the theory of ideology, which has found conclusive expression in Pareto, is really nothing more than an attempt to understand all contents of consciousness purely in terms of psychological interests without reference to the objectivity of society. I have already said something about the origin of this retrogressive development and the reasons behind it, and also about how it erases the distinction between truth and lie, or untruth, which is contained in the concept of ideology itself. Here I would just like to point out that the objectivity that attaches to the concept of ideology also contains an aspect or moment of its own truth, and indeed in a manifold sense. Firstly, in the sense that, if some form of consciousness is produced through a necessary process, then something of this necessity itself will also find expression in this consciousness. The consciousness in question, therefore, is never utterly and completely forsaken by truth. So we see that Marx criticized the theory of free and fair exchange as presented in liberalism. Yet in doing so he also acknowledged and held on to something that was implied in this ideology, namely the fact that such exchange is realized under the formal conditions of freedom, and that, in contrast to the feudal phase that had gone before, concepts such as freedom and equality are in fact also involved in advance here. In other words, once we emphatically speak of ideology, then that which is characterized as ideology is no longer simply being characterized as a lie. On the contrary, it is already characterized as something which is necessary in order to legitimate the social reality which the ideology captures, and also as an aspect or moment that expresses something of the essence of the society which produces this ideology. For although it is true that the process of exchange is neither free nor fair in bourgeois society, and although it is false to say that the employer and the worker encounter each other on nothing but the basis of their own labor in the act of exchange, it is still true that exchange involves some kind of equivalence, and that a more searching investigation, namely the analysis of labor value and the commodity form, is required in order to show that something more is involved in the exchange relation. Moreover, we must also recognize that ideologies in their classical form almost always involve an aspect or moment that points beyond the real social conditions to which they are applied. Thus bourgeois society basically claims, here we are dealing all the time with actual things, We are a society made up of free and equal partners who exchange their labor time in a reciprocal manner, a society in which, let me put it this way, each person gets his due. Now, of course, as critics of ideology, you can easily show that this is not the case. But, once such an ideology is formulated, the claim to such a society is already formulated too, the claim for there to be a society of free and equal members, a society where everyone would indeed receive their due. So, when we criticize a society based on exchange, it does not imply simply that exchange is to be abolished, it also implies that what exchange promises, that we are not cheated or deceived in the process, is actually to be achieved and fulfilled. In this sense, therefore, you can also apply the concept of dialectic to the theory of ideology. The very concept of dialectic means that exposing the difference between ideology and reality already serves and intrinsically implies the possibility that the criticized ideology not only fall away, but also that it be realized. The critique of ideology harbors the possibility that ideology shall become reality, and it is precisely this which essentially distinguishes a genuinely penetrating critique of ideology from the purely negative or purely subjectivistic critique of ideology, which believes it is merely dealing with the more or less contingent and subjective sources of a mistaken or deluded consciousness, sources which can be eliminated or removed at will. If I said that ideology also expresses something true, I must come back in this connection to classical ideology, in other words, to the ideology of liberalism. For I want to say something to you about precisely why in this case we are really talking about ideology par excellence, the very model for the concept of ideology generally. Here you must also remember that this theory, as formulated in the context of classical political economy, which basically claims that the whole is held together precisely insofar as all its constituent moments pursue their own interests independently, also expresses truth because society does indeed reproduce itself, and reproduce itself in a continually expanding way, through this mechanism of competition or, to put it more accurately, this mechanism of universal exchange. In other words, the life of society really depends upon this principle. And the necessity of this liberal ideology lies solely in its expression of this fact. Thus it is only when you also acknowledge this moment of objective truth in liberalism that you can properly recognize the moment of untruth that it equally involves, and that alone would represent a case of genuinely dialectical thinking. Anything else would fall back even behind the concept of mere ratiocination upon which Hegel had already justifiably poured his scorn and contempt. But I think that I also owe you a few further remarks at least on the concept of ideology itself, and its prospects today, and on the essence of ideology in the contemporary context. I not feel it would be right if we merely contented ourselves with the history of dogma, or simply engaged in reflections on the past here, and avoided the issue regarding the status of the concept of ideology and the question of ideology today. You will not of course expect me to offer you a fully developed theory of ideology at this point. You can certainly find many of the elements that would contribute to such a theory if you take a look at our Dialectic of Enlightenment, and especially the chapter dedicated to the culture industry. The thoughts that I would like to offer you on this subject here are really just arabesques to what you can read there, for I generally like to avoid, if possible, simply regurgitating for you what is already contained in our published theoretical texts. So now we are all basically clear that ideologies also change along with history itself, although we have seen that this change in ideologies proceeds more slowly than that of the social economic base, and although we have seen, if we look at history more closely, that it is the functions of certain fundamental claims persisting from the age of the Stoics through to bourgeois society as a whole, which have actually changed, rather than that these fundamental claims as such were radically replaced by quite different ones. But you must bear in mind here, since bourgeois society has always been internally divided and the identity between the universal and the particular which it affirmed has never actually been realized, that the theoretical interpretations of this society have also contradicted one another. In this sense, there is no such thing as one bourgeois ideology precisely because there is no one bourgeois society. Or, to put this more exactly, because the one bourgeois society is defined precisely by the internal fracture, by the class relationship, which it involves. And the lack of identity, the unreconciled character of the relationship between universal and particular, is decisively reflected in the form assumed by the ideologies in question. Thus, in a rather striking way, we can distinguish between those theoretical positions which effectively uphold the side of the universal. In the history of modern thought, these are the rationalistic positions, and those which uphold the side of the particular, which are the empiricist positions. Nonetheless, after what we have heard, it proves impossible, in terms of a theory of social class, to establish an unambiguous coordination between one or other of these philosophical positions and one or other specific class. This is because the whole, with all of its internal fractures, actually reveals itself in both of these theoretical positions, and that is why they also change their functions historically and are also mediated with one another in multiple ways. If we approach these things in a philosophical way, we soon discover, since each such form of philosophy tries to grasp the whole, however inadequately, that the whole also presents itself, in however fractured a fashion, in every one of these philosophies. So, for example, you will be able to find elements of conceptual realism within empiricist approaches and also find that the reverse is true. Thus we may consider our old friend Bacon, whom I mentioned earlier, though I should perhaps say Bacon the younger, since of course we are talking of Francis Bacon here rather than of the scholastic or pre-scholastic Roger Bacon. For it has often been pointed out that, even in the case of Bacon, who played his cards quite openly, what we find is a radically empiricist program that is nonetheless combined with a completely unshaken faith in the essences of the Aristotelian tradition, and to that extent Bacon might be described as a half-medieval and a half-modern thinker. In response to this, I think we should recognize that this is not because he lived in what is ominously described as a time of transition, a rather childish notion that I would be happy to see you dispense with altogether. For the real reason is that empiricist thought, even here in its very early modern phase, was already faced with the double task of doing justice to the particular aspects of experience while also trying to grasp them as an integrated whole. Where the changing role of ideologies is concerned, we see a constant process of selection taking place between these two ideal types or extreme possibilities. Yet, whichever of these theoretical approaches is selected, we always find that one also contains elements of the other. This is because one approach on its own, one of these divided halves of reality, if I can put it that way, is not sufficient to grasp the whole. Yet, at the same time, under the conditions of an antagonistic and divided world, no genuine internal synthesis is possible. The most impressive attempt at such a synthesis in fact is that of Hegel. I would just remark in passing that the considerations I have been suggesting to you here might also become clearer and easier to grasp if you bear in mind that certain invariant features of bourgeois society, co-market society, have persisted since ancient times and still continue to manifest themselves. Thus, when we are talking about substantive questions with regard to ethics, law and the state, that is, when we are talking about the relationship of philosophy to society, we find that the actual divergences between thinkers who are emphatically opposed to one another in terms of their fundamental epistemological or metaphysical positions turn out to be far less striking than we would ever have imagined. In the field of ethics, for example, you will find that the rejection of compassion as a ground for how we should relate to each other is shared by thinkers who are otherwise utterly different from one another, such as Spinoza in the early bourgeois age, Kant in the age of revolution, or Nietzsche in the age of imperialism. Yet the radical differences of fundamental approach here would seem to have had little influence on the idea that one should try and follow reason rather than give in to the heart. This is naturally connected with the fact that all these thinkers can actually be seen as ideological in the specific sense that the necessary demands of false bourgeois consciousness are reflected in their case too, that they are all forced to expect a certain kind of rationality from human beings if the latter are to function in this society precisely as they are required to do. The identity of the social structure here makes itself felt in all these theoretical positions, even in the face of the narrower ideological, that is the abstractly philosophical, difference that defines the starting point of each thinker. You can apply this observation to countless other categories beyond that of compassion, and it would be an excellent subject for a dissertation if someone could show how philosophies which utterly contradict one another officially may still frequently agree on what may look like rather eccentric ideas. And you can be sure, when you stumble on these paradoxical points of agreement, that you have actually come upon a very fundamental stratum, or bedrock, of bourgeois civilization itself. But when I speak of the essentially historical character of ideologies, it should be quite clear, if I may emphasize this once again, that it belongs to the essence of ideology that, although the various conditions, insights, forms of behavior, whatever it is, have been historically produced and have come to be what they are, all of this, in the context of ideology, is almost always presented as something that exists in itself or possesses some intrinsic being as such. One might say that the fetishization of the historical, in other words, the absolutizing of what has become what it is and the forgetting of how it came to be what it is a necessary characteristic of ideology. And one can even show that forgetting as such is a constitutive category for the overall form that modern epistemology has assumed. Thus we might say that something like the consciousness of things in the context of philosophy is only possible when the undiminished actuality of the phenomena to be synthesized is no longer present to us, and we thus forget or neglect certain aspects of these phenomena. And it is only through what is no longer present in the phenomena, in other words through a kind of stasis or deprivation, that they first become susceptible to what metaphysical and epistemological theories have so lauded under the name of synthesis. The cognitive achievement involved in such theories of knowledge is an achievement of forgetting, for something which has become what it is here appears as an absolute. This alone helps you to understand the relationship of ideology to history itself. While ideology is constitutively dependent on history, it must nonetheless deny the latter precisely in order to uphold the absolute truth content it claims. History is the scar, the critical point, of ideology as such. Once we can expose the historical origin of a particular ideology, it forfeits that illusory appearance of absoluteness which is essential to its existence. Now when you recognize that ideologies are intrinsically entwined with history, this seems to open up an extremely important aspect that points in another direction as well. For it is not just that ideologies themselves change. The essence of ideology also changes, if I can put it that way. In other words, the contents of consciousness are not equally ideological at all times. There is a more or less where ideology is concerned. In the course of our earlier reflections on the theory of ideology, I have already spoken at various points about the way that ideology has become more tenuous and more fragmented today. It is either merely a duplication of what already exists or nothing but the kind of naked lie currently propagated by dictatorships. I have thereby already indicated that one cannot just take over the concept of ideology as if it were a constant that is equally valid for all epochs. Now there is a subjective and an objective side to this. On the objective side, it seems that ideology in an emphatic sense presupposes a highly developed society. An ideology as such can really emerge only where the base is articulated enough to provide a closed motivational context to which the superstructure then corresponds. Now in primitive nomadic or hunter-gatherer societies of one kind or another, one certainly cannot speak of ideologies at all, for the concept of ideology presupposes a certain kind of social objectification, a kind of alienation on the part of socialized subjects. It is only where society has taken on a certain weight or power of its own in relation to socialized subjects, only where society is no longer immediately identical with socialized human beings themselves but has already become extended and objectified, that something like the formation and development of an ideology is really possible. And on the other side, namely the subjective side, I would say that ideology presupposes a relatively highly developed level of rationality. Ideology in an emphatic sense can arise only where the claim to the rational, legitimate or justifiable character of society has already in some sense become universal. Now if you have developed a certain sensitivity, a good ear, as it were, for these things, you will notice that there is not really much point in talking about something such as feudal ideology. For where a genuinely feudal society exists, where such a society is relatively unproblematic and actually functions, the human mind will certainly attempt to derive and justify the prevailing hierarchical conditions in some way by appealing to philosophy or principles of natural law. But no one will try and prove these structures themselves as a thorough expression of rationality. That is why there are no such things as legitimating ideologies of feudalism in the feudal period itself, nothing which could really be compared with bourgeois ideologies. Now I would say that, today, in a world where bourgeois society is trembling or already broken in so many ways, there can no longer be ideologies in the sense of attempts to show the coherent rational character of society. Thus if we think about Searle or Nietzsche's vitalism in this connection, and both thinkers actually have an extraordinary amount in common here, you can see that the real basis of ideology as an attempt to show the immanent rationality of society has effectively been shattered. Now if we try and make these things intelligible at all, I believe it may perhaps be somewhat exaggerated, though no more so than one actually has the right to exaggerate here, to say that the concept of ideology is not an abstract universal concept, but one that strictly applies only to bourgeois society. Thus there are no feudal ideologies, but only feudalistic ones, or what we might call restorationist ideologies, and it is no accident that the great theoretical formulations in this regard, we might think here of Plato's glorification of the hierarchical system of Spartan society as a kind of utopia, or of the glorification of absolutism that you find in Die Meister, belong to times of attempted restoration. In other words, they belong to times in which, as Hegel says, the rational and traditional forms of social order which are glorified in this way no longer enjoy substantial existence, or even are no longer actually present. For what is common to all these great restorationist thinkers is that they are all confronted with the genuinely paradoxical task of justifying the irrational itself, the irrational character of those societies themselves, precisely by appeal to rationality. In other words, there is really only something such as feudal ideology under the form of romanticism. Lecture 15. The 19th of July 1960. Ladies and gentlemen, now allow me to come to the central issue, and let me try today